In this episode, we begin with a topic that often sounds highly specialized the first time you hear it, but it becomes much easier to understand once you see what problem it is trying to solve inside a real organization. Key risk indicators are simply signals that help a business notice whether risk may be increasing, becoming more likely, or moving closer to a level that deserves attention from decision makers. For a beginner, the most useful way to think about KRIs is as early warning signs tied to risk, not just as random numbers in a dashboard. A mature organization does not want to wait until a loss, outage, breach, or compliance failure has already happened before it realizes conditions were getting worse. Defining and establishing KRIs is about choosing those warning signs carefully, connecting them to the risks that matter, and setting them up so leaders and teams can actually use them to notice change before a problem becomes a crisis. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is the difference between risk itself and an indicator of risk, because new learners often mix those together. A risk is a possibility that something harmful or disruptive could happen and affect the organization's objectives, operations, finances, reputation, or obligations. A KRI is not the risk itself. It is a measurable sign that helps people judge whether the risk may be rising, becoming more urgent, or drifting outside the level the organization is willing to tolerate. If an organization worries about third-party failure, for example, the risk is not the same thing as an indicator showing rising vendor issues, contract exceptions, or unresolved findings. The indicator is a signal that conditions related to the risk may be changing. This distinction matters because people sometimes try to define KRIs that merely restate the risk in different words, and that does not help anyone monitor reality. An indicator must give the organization something observable that can be tracked over time and interpreted in a meaningful way. Another useful distinction is between KRIs and ordinary metrics, because not every measurement deserves the word key. Organizations measure many things every day, including workload, service speed, project progress, financial performance, and technical activity. Some of those measurements are operationally useful, but they may have little to do with risk exposure. A KRI should earn its place by helping the organization understand whether a meaningful risk is becoming more likely, more severe, or harder to control. That means the measurement should have a strong relationship to the risk being watched. A beginner might think any security number can become a KRI, such as the total number of alerts or the number of tickets opened in a month, but raw numbers do not automatically explain changing exposure. A KRI needs context and relevance. It should tell a story about risk conditions, not just provide activity data. If the number does not help leaders understand what may be getting worse, then it is probably just a metric and not a true KRI. This is why KRIs matter so much in risk management. Without them, organizations often operate in a reactive way, discovering important changes only after loss, disruption, or public embarrassment has already occurred. A well-defined KRI helps create awareness before the worst outcome happens. It gives the organization a better chance to investigate, intervene, adjust treatment plans, or elevate concern to the right level of leadership. In that sense, KRIs support better judgment under uncertainty. They do not predict the future with perfect accuracy, and that is important to remember. They are not magical warnings that eliminate surprise. Instead, they improve visibility into conditions that often move before major problems become visible. For beginners, this is one of the most valuable ideas in the whole topic. Good risk management is not only about documenting risks in a register. It is also about building the ability to notice when those risks may be shifting in the wrong direction while there is still time to respond in a measured and intelligent way. To define a strong KRI, you first need a clear risk statement, because weak indicators often grow out of vague understanding. If the organization cannot explain what risk it is concerned about, it will struggle to choose a meaningful warning sign. A useful risk statement usually identifies what could happen, what asset, process, or objective could be affected, and what kind of impact might follow. Once that risk is clear, people can begin asking what measurable conditions might suggest that the risk is becoming more serious or more likely to occur. That thinking helps anchor the indicator to real exposure instead of to whatever data happens to be easy to collect. For example, if the concern is risk from uncontrolled privileged access, the organization should not start by asking what numbers are available. It should start by asking what changing conditions would make that risk worse or make the control environment less reliable. Defining KRIs becomes much stronger when the organization works from risk meaning outward rather than from available data inward. That leads naturally to the idea of relevance, because a KRI should reflect something that actually matters to the underlying risk. Good relevance means there is a reasonable connection between the indicator and the exposure being monitored. If that connection is weak, the organization may end up watching movement that looks important but says very little about real conditions. This is a common beginner mistake. People often pick indicators that are easy to count, attractive on a chart, or popular in other organizations, then assume those figures must be useful in their own environment. But a number becomes meaningful only when it helps the business understand its own risk picture. A relevant KRI should make a decision maker more informed about whether the risk needs attention, further analysis, or a change in treatment. If the number rises or falls and nobody can explain why that matters for the risk itself, then the organization may be measuring noise. Strong KRI definition depends on choosing signals that are tied to exposure, not merely visible in reports. A related concept is timeliness, because a useful KRI should help the organization notice something in time to act. If an indicator tells you only what already went wrong last quarter, it may still have value, but it is less effective as an early warning signal. Many organizations want KRIs that show developing conditions before major harm becomes unavoidable. That does not mean every KRI must be highly predictive, because risk monitoring often includes both earlier and later signals. Still, beginners should understand that the strongest KRIs usually help decision-makers see movement early enough to ask questions and take action while options still exist. This is why some indicators are described informally as leading signs, while others are more backward-looking. The important point is not mastering special terminology. The important point is choosing indicators that improve visibility soon enough to matter. A KRI that arrives after the damage is already done may describe the event well, but it does much less to support timely and preventive risk management. When organizations begin establishing KRIs, they also need to think carefully about thresholds, because a number without interpretation can create confusion. A threshold is the point or range at which an indicator should trigger attention, review, escalation, or some other response. Without thresholds, people may watch the data move every month without knowing when the movement becomes meaningful enough to matter. This is where KRIs become much more practical. If an indicator is meant to show whether a condition remains acceptable, then the organization needs some shared understanding of what acceptable, concerning, and unacceptable look like in that context. Those boundaries do not need to be perfect from the beginning, but they should reflect business judgment, historical patterns, risk appetite, and operational reality. Beginners sometimes assume thresholds are fixed forever, yet many organizations refine them as they learn more. Establishing a KRI includes deciding not only what to measure, but also how much change should prompt attention and what level of movement should make leaders stop assuming everything is fine. Ownership is another critical part of establishing KRIs, because indicators do not manage themselves. Someone must be accountable for defining them, validating the data, reviewing the results, and making sure the information reaches the people who need it. This does not mean one person does everything. In practice, different roles may contribute: business context, data support, control insight, risk oversight, and leadership review. Still, without clear ownership, KRI programs tend to weaken quickly. Data may be collected inconsistently, interpretations may differ, and concerning changes may sit unnoticed because everyone assumes another group is watching them. A beginner should understand that establishing a KRI is not just about creating a dashboard field. It is about connecting the indicator to a real process of oversight and response. When ownership is clear, the organization is much more likely to review the indicator seriously, ask sensible follow-up questions, and act when the trend moves beyond expectations instead of treating the measurement as background reporting that nobody truly uses. Data quality also deserves serious attention, because even a well-chosen KRI can mislead if the underlying information is incomplete, delayed, inconsistent, or poorly understood. A strong indicator depends on data that is reliable enough to support decision-making. That does not mean every source must be perfect, but the organization should understand the limits of what the data can and cannot tell it. Beginners sometimes assume that because a number came from a system or formal report, it must be trustworthy. In reality, data can be shaped by process gaps, inconsistent definitions, manual entry problems, missing scope, or timing differences that make trends look better or worse than they really are. When establishing KRIs, organizations should ask basic questions about where the data comes from, how often it is updated, whether the same method is used each time, and whether the number reflects the full area of concern. Good KRI practice depends on disciplined measurement, because poor data quality can create false confidence just as easily as poor risk analysis can. It is also helpful to remember that one KRI rarely tells the whole story. Risk conditions are often complex, and a single number may reveal only one angle of a larger problem. That is why mature organizations often use a small set of related indicators rather than pretending one measurement can capture every important change. The goal is not to overwhelm leaders with endless charts. The goal is to create a balanced view of the risk environment. For example, one indicator might show rising backlog in a key review process, while another might show increasing exception rates, and together they may tell a more meaningful story than either one alone. For a beginner, the lesson is not that more indicators are always better. In fact, too many measurements can bury what matters. The lesson is that KRI design should be thoughtful enough to recognize when risk needs more than one visible signal. A well-established set of KRIs should clarify the risk picture, not complicate it until nobody can tell what deserves concern. Communication is another major part of establishment, because an indicator only creates value when people understand what it means. A KRI report should do more than present a number. It should help the audience understand whether the risk appears stable, rising, improving, or uncertain, and why that interpretation matters. This is especially important when reporting to senior stakeholders who may not want raw detail, but still need clear insight into changing exposure. Beginners sometimes think KRI work ends when the chart is produced, but that misses the point. The organization needs interpretation, context, and a path from observation to action. If a KRI breaches a threshold, someone should know whether the next step is investigation, escalation, control review, risk acceptance discussion, or another kind of follow-up. Communication keeps the KRI tied to decision-making instead of leaving it as passive information. Establishing KRIs, therefore, includes deciding how results will be presented, how often they will be reviewed, and how the organization will respond when the picture changes. One of the most common problems in this area is choosing indicators that are attractive but not actionable. A measurement might look impressive in a report and still fail to help anyone decide what to do next. This happens when the relationship to the risk is weak, when thresholds are meaningless, or when the number reflects conditions that the organization cannot interpret clearly enough to respond. Another common mistake is choosing KRIs only because they are easy to produce, even if they do not tell much about risk movement. Ease of collection matters, but it should not replace usefulness. There is also the risk of selecting indicators that are too broad, too narrow, or too dependent on unstable data. Beginners should see that defining KRIs is partly an exercise in discipline and restraint. The organization is trying to select signals that genuinely improve awareness of important exposure, not simply fill reporting space. Strong establishment requires the courage to reject measurements that look busy but do not help the organization notice, discuss, and manage changing risk conditions in a meaningful way. Over time, KRIs should be refined as the organization learns from use, because the first version is rarely perfect. A threshold may prove too sensitive and create constant noise. A data source may turn out to be less reliable than expected. An indicator may seem relevant at first, but later show little connection to real changes in exposure. That does not mean the KRI program failed. It means the organization is learning how risk appears in its own environment. Mature risk management does not treat indicators as permanent artifacts carved in stone. It treats them as tools that should become sharper through review and experience. Beginners sometimes expect that once a KRI is defined, the work is done. In reality, establishment includes the willingness to test, review, and improve. The organization should ask whether the indicator still reflects the risk well, whether people understand it, whether it supports timely action, and whether it remains aligned with business priorities and evolving conditions rather than with outdated assumptions. As you step back from the details, the heart of this topic becomes easier to hold on to. Defining and establishing KRIs means choosing meaningful warning signs for important risks, setting thresholds that make those signs understandable, assigning ownership, ensuring the data is trustworthy enough to support judgment, and building a review process that connects measurement to action. Good KRIs do not eliminate uncertainty, and they do not guarantee that the organization will avoid every adverse event. What they do is improve awareness, create earlier visibility into changing exposure, and give leaders a better chance to act before a bad outcome becomes unavoidable. That is why this work matters so much in real risk management. For someone new to CRISC thinking, the most important takeaway is simple. The organization becomes stronger when it can recognize that a risk environment is changing before the loss arrives, and well-defined, well-established KRIs are one of the clearest ways to build that kind of awareness.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.